that law is legal. Under the measure, state law enforcement has the power to arrest people accused of crossing the southern border illegally. That typically is under federal jurisdiction. Federal jurisdiction meaning that it is up to federal agencies like the Border Patrol to patrol the border, to enforce immigration law, not up to states. Yesterday, we had announced that Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito had extended an order that was barring Texas from detaining and jailing migrants. It seems that now, while the law is under review, it will be allowed the state of Texas to at least continue jailing some migrants. CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez has been following this, and he is on the phone with us now. So, Camilo, this decision is not final, clearly. Can you talk to us about what the ruling is or where it stands at this point and how it differs from the news that we gave yesterday, where Texas was being held from being able to continue to stop and jail migrants?
That's right, Lilia. The bottom line is that Texas state officials at the state and local level can now arrest, stop, and detain migrants who are suspected of crossing into the U.S. illegally from Mexico, and also allow state judges to issue de facto deportation orders against suspected violators of this law known as SB4 that the Biden administration, Lilia, has argued is unconstitutional and interferes with immigration enforcement, which, as you know, has for many years and decades, in fact, been a federal responsibility, something that is typically carried out by agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, not individual states. But right now, the Supreme Court is allowing Texas to enforce this law through this procedural order that, again, as you underscored, does not actually get into the merits of the law or its legality, but it allows the state nevertheless to implement it while an appeals court in New Orleans reviews the actual legality of it. It is important to note, Lilia, that a federal judge in Texas has already said that this law is unlawful, that it violates the Constitution, and that federal immigration enforcement would be hindered by this law because, again, arresting and deporting migrants, are federal responsibilities. But that ruling by that judge in Texas has been stayed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That is now the court that will review the legality. But again, until that ruling comes to fruition, the state can implement this.
Let's talk about the practice. Camilo, I am old enough to remember SB 1070, which was a law that back in the era of Sheriff Joe Arpaio was extremely controversial in Arizona. And it was already decided in the year 2012 that you cannot pass laws like these. You cannot have law enforcement stop migrants without engaging in racial profiling, which is what made it back then unconstitutional. What are the concerns right now? Is this a similar debate, for people who are wondering, okay, so why is it up to the federal government and why not up to state authorities, given that there is a crisis at the border? Why not have the state police or local police agencies engage in this? Talk to us about what the pushback is against this law.
Well, Lilia, critics of the law have certainly said that it would lead to racial profiling because they believe law enforcement officials at the local and state levels will not be able to adequately and properly determine whether someone is a migrant or not, or whether someone crossed into the U.S. illegally. They believe that that probable cause is too vague and can lead to U.S. citizens or permanent legal residents or other immigrants who are here lawfully to be caught up in this enforcement of this law. But Texas has argued that this is in some ways a narrow law because they are going to go after people who agents see crossing the border illegally or migrants who are found in cars where smugglers are trying to smuggle people into the country. So Texas has argued that this is needed to deter illegal immigration and to discourage people from crossing the border illegally, but obviously critics say it will lead to racial profiling. Critics also say, Lilia, that this will divert key and limited public safety resources away from more serious crimes, and that it will prevent county and state officials from focusing on those more serious criminal efforts like human trafficking, murders, and other more serious crimes, because agents and officials are going to be diverted to focus on arresting migrants.
Yeah, that's something that I wanted to ask you about. I mean, I remember doing ride-alongs when Operation Lone Star started, and you had the Texas Department of Public Safety engaging in something like this, in pretty much detaining migrants, but it was very limited to only within ranches where the owners of those ranches had given them access. And I remember talking to both Border Patrol and to state police, and them talking about how they kind of shared intelligence and resources sometimes, but in the implementation, it seemed like a lot of officers, and this is at the beginning again, I would see all of these patrol cars from the Texas DPS just there, just standing and waiting to get some intel from Border Patrol so that they could do this whole thing. And it just seemed very political. Do state officials or officers have what they need to be able to surveil, to stop people, to detain? I mean, talk to us about the complexities of not just potentially neglecting their law enforcement duties in other areas and securing, the livelihoods and the lives of Texans. But do they have what they need to implement this at the border to focus on those, bailouts, as they call them, at the border, or to focus on the people who they literally see with their own eyes crossing?
Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask the Department of Public Safety, which is the state agency that oversees the state troopers and is one of the entities that will be able to enforce this law, they will tell you, Lilia, that they do have the training, the equipment, and the agents to carry out these arrests. And in fact, they will tell you, Lilia, that the state is already arresting some migrants on criminal trespassing charges. The state of Texas right now is with the consent of local property owners, arresting some migrants for the violation of the trespassing statute at the state level. But again, that requires the consent of ranchers and other property owners. This SB4 law will get rid of that. It will allow state troopers and other agents to arrest migrants who are suspected of crossing into the U.S. without permission anywhere along the Texas-Mexico border. But I will tell you that even people who support SB4, including the sheriff of Kinney County, a border community near Eagle Pass, have told us and conceded to us that they may not have the resources to enforce this law. And this sheriff of Kinney County, Brad Coe, supports SB4, but he noted that he will face operational challenges in implementing it because he only has 6 full-time deputies to prosecute and arrest and enforce all laws in his county.
Yeah. What does a CBP, what does the Department of Homeland Security, and perhaps, I know that you spend a lot of time there at the border, and I'm sure you talk to a lot of Border Patrol agents. What's the overall feeling that the federal agencies and the federal officers who are, or agents who are tasked with implementing federal law think about this?
Well, one of the key open questions that we have to monitor, Lilia, is whether federal authorities, that being the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection, as you mentioned, will cooperate with Texas in implementing this law because, yes, one of the provisions of this law allows the state to arrest and prosecute migrants who are suspected of crossing into the U.S. illegally, but another provision allows state magistrate judges to require migrants to return to Mexico as an alternative to prosecuting them. Problem is that every port of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border is administered by federal officials, not the state of Texas. So it's unclear how Texas will essentially deport migrants back to Mexico or other countries when there is no state infrastructure to do so. So that would require the collaboration and consent of federal officials. And I think under this administration, at least, it will be unlikely that the feds will cooperate with the state in carrying out these state deportations. The other factor is that the Mexican government, Lilia, has denounced this law as anti-immigrant and have actually vowed to reject any returns of migrants by the state of Texas.
Wow. Camilo, I keep thinking about, that bipartisan bill that did not pass. I mean, there is all of this attention being paid to the border, to migration at the border, to solutions that are needed, to the point that the governor of Texas and Texas law enforcement are saying, look, it's up to the state as well. We're participating, we're chipping in, we're going to start detaining migrants too. What is the latest on those other possible solutions that needed to be passed in Congress, which include some funding, and also perhaps what other solutions were not implemented by that bill failing?
Well, Congress, as you know, Lilia, has remained desperately gridlocked on the issue of immigration. The U.S. immigration system has not been updated since the 1990s, and that gridlock has not changed materially in any way. We saw a bipartisan group of senators broker a compromise with the White House a few weeks ago, but Republicans in Congress, after demanding drastic limits to asylum, rejected that proposal, saying that it was not strict enough. And obviously, former President Donald Trump came out against this deal, so there was also a political consideration that lawmakers had to consider when opposing this deal, and it is very likely that one of the main reasons that Republicans rejected this agreement, despite it containing provisions in the law that they have demanded for decades, is because it could undermine potentially former President Donald Trump's chances of using this issue as a way to attack President Biden. Obviously, immigration is one of the defining issues in this election, and former President Donald Trump certainly believes that it is a winning issue for him because of the humanitarian crisis that we have seen along the U.S.-Mexico border over the past 3 years. So in terms of any congressional action on this issue, Lilia, I think that's very unlikely. We could see, however, the Biden administration take unilateral steps to deal with this crisis at the executive branch level. The current president, President Biden, has been considering executive action, we are told, including by invoking a sweeping presidential authority known as 212F that allows presidents to suspend the entry of migrants when it is determined that their entry could be detrimental to the country. And that could potentially lead to a crackdown at the border and a significant restriction in who is allowed to seek asylum. But obviously, President Biden has not taken any executive action yet, but he is considering it.
And tell me something, Camilo. How would that executive action be different, if at all, from, say, what we were seeing under Title 42?
Well, Title 42 was a pandemic-era rule that was tied to the pandemic. The argument was that migrants were posing a public health risk because they could spread the coronavirus inside the U.S. That was the public health justification, at least, even though there were some significant disagreements within the CDC as to whether or not this policy actually curtailed the spread of COVID. But that was the justification, and it allowed officials to just turn people back across the border without any asylum screening. What the president is considering now, we are told, is an executive action that would disqualify migrants from asylum if they cross the border in between the ports of entry illegally. And so it would allow agents to effectively say, the country is full, our asylum system is full, you're crossing the border illegally, and so you do not merit asylum, and you have to go back to Mexico or to another country. We do expect asylum processing in that event to continue at the ports of entry.
Right,
and
that's the difference. They'd be open.
This is where migrants are still being able to request asylum if they secure an appointment on that CBP-1 app, that is that government smartphone app that some migrants in Mexico are using to enter the U.S.
Yeah. Fascinating, Camilo. Thank you so much for making yourself available right away as we learn of this breaking news and your extensive reporting on this, on bringing us the story. Much appreciated. Just as a recap, we're following this breaking news. The Supreme Court is allowing a controversial immigration enforcement law in Texas. That's SB4, as they continue to evaluate its legality. So allowing or empowering Texas law enforcement to continue detaining, jailing migrants who they suspect of crossing the border illegally. We're going to take a very quick break. Up next, the latest on budget talks on the Capitol Hill. Congressional leaders and the White House have reached a deal to fund the government, but what will it take to get it over the finish line? We'll tell you that coming up. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Residents, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.